Story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Though you are far away, wonderful story of love, still he doth call to.
All right, so chapter 18, and I want to begin by reading the first 5 verses. I don't know if I'll read the whole chapter like this, but I do want to read the first 5 verses as we get into it. And you're going to notice that yet again, another chapter in this book begins exactly the same way. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do what is done in the land of Egypt where you lived, nor are you to do what is done in the land of Canaan where I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You are to perform my judgments and keep my statutes, to live in accord with them. I am the Lord your God. So you shall keep my statutes and my judgments, by which a man may live if he does them. I am the Lord." You might notice that there is a repetitive phrase. He continually reminds them, I am the Lord. What does that mean, I am the Lord? Putting it in just simple, direct, daily language. What's he saying when he says to them, I am the Lord? Yeah, he has the authority. So he says, you need to listen and walk after the things that I do, not the things that the Egyptians did where you used to live, not the things that the people in the land who currently possess the land of Canaan do where you're about to live. Don't follow after the behaviors of other men. Follow my commandments, and then that word, and my judgments, by which a man may live. What are we trying to do? Why are we here at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday night when there's probably other things that we have to do? I'm sorry? Anyone? Why? What are we trying to accomplish? Why do we study the Bible? To learn. We can learn about a lot of things. I mean, I want to live. Not eternally on the earth in a body, but I do want to live with God. I want to be resurrected. So he's answering at the very outset of this chapter. If you'll listen to my judgments and do them, you may live. Now, what is the implication of saying if? That's a conditional thing, right? If you listen to my commandments, if you listen to my judgments and live by them, you may live. Well, what does that mean if the condition isn't met? If I don't listen to God and live by his judgments, I may not live. And not in the sense that we use that language today sometimes, where it's possible I'll live or it's possible I won't live, but I'm allowed to live. If you're asking permission, I teach people this all the time. If you're asking permission, what's the question? May I? Not can I. Can I is a question of ability. God will permit you to live. What happens if you don't listen to his judgments and live according to them? He will not permit you to live. So this is the Lord speaking. It makes that very clear. The people are all addressed. This isn't just to Moses. It isn't just to Moses and Aaron. It's not just to the priests. It's not just to the really super religious people. And then the rest of the people don't matter. And you're going to find out as we go through the rest of this book that a lot of these things he reiterates with them that it's not just for the descendants of Israel, but also for what? Anyone who sojourns with them. Anyone who is living among them must follow these rules, or there's a consequence to pay for it. They're to follow the Lord's judgments. And what about my own judgments? Have you ever heard anyone say, well, I just don't see anything wrong with it? I mean, I've heard it countless times about many things that are clearly condemned by God. What they're saying when they say, I just don't see anything wrong with it, is my judgment is this is not harmful. What God is saying at the outset of this chapter is these things are important because they are harmful, whether you realize it or not. You need to be concerned with my judgment about these things, not your own. Now, there's a chapter, I want to say it's in Isaiah, where we read that our thoughts are not his thoughts, our ways are not his ways, because what reason? His ways are higher, his thoughts are higher. But is the point of that we cannot think and do his ways? No. The point is what? That we have to listen to him and follow his judgments in order to do that. That it's, as it's put by another prophet, it's not in a man that walks to direct his steps. Or yet again by another prophet, that the way of man is not in himself. That the way of man leads to destruction. That's in direct contrast to what he's saying his judgments do. If you listen to my judgments and live according to my ways, that leads to life. But man's ways, the way that they lived in Egypt, the way that they lived in Canaan, doesn't matter which direction you go. The people you knew before, the people you know ahead of you, doesn't really matter. If you're following a man's ways, it's destruction. The standard is established at the outset. So everything else that follows in this chapter is what God's judgments are about these things. All right. Very often, verses 6 through 18 or so, well, really down to 23, I guess. From about 6 to 23, have a big heading in your Bible that'll say something along the lines of laws concerning sexual relationships. The danger of those headings are it puts the focus on the wrong thing. There's certainly a lot of that talked about here. But that's not all that's talked about here. And that's an important thing, a distinction to make. Yes, ma'am. Well, if you read this the way most people read it, that's a perfectly good way to express it. He's saying that to do those things is to practice sexual immorality. And so by learning what causes you to be in sexual immorality, you learn how to be sexually moral. It's teaching from the negative, which is a perfectly good way to do it. So he says, no one's to approach, let's look at verse 6. None of you shall approach any blood relative of his to uncover nakedness. Now, let's just be perfectly clear. Uncover nakedness is an idiom. It is talking about intimacy between people. All right. I want to make the same point now that I made about the dietary stuff. Before this verse, before these rules were given, had God made any restrictions along those lines? No. Who was Abraham married to? His sister. Remember when she was taken from him? And he said, she's my sister. And so they took her away. Now, it was his half sister, but he deals with that here too in those things. There was no prohibition against that. Who did the descendants of Adam and Eve marry? Their siblings. There's nothing ever said contrary to that or to suggest that that would. Who did the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth marry? Siblings or cousins. That's all there was. Those three brothers and their wives had children, and those children had to intermarry. Well, I think ethnicity and isolated gene pools came from the separation at Babel. But we have to understand that what he's saying here in verse 6 is something that they've never heard before and that has never been an issue before. But now God is making it an issue. And this is his judgment. You don't go to your father or your mother. That's verse 7. Now look at verse 8. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. Wait a minute. He just talked about your mother. Well, this is a wife that's not your mother. We would call that this person what? A stepmother. That's what we refer to them as. They didn't have that kind of delineation or difference at that time. This is very much akin to the language that's used in 1 Corinthians 5, where there was this abomination among the church at Corinth that they were putting up with, and it said, one of you has his father's wife. It doesn't say one of you has his mother. It says one of you has his father's wife. It's the same idea here. Anyone who is now, there's no actual blood kin between your father's wife and you. But there's a close relationship. And he's saying, you just don't do that. It's just not proper. And I'll tell you why. He gives an answer for it. Does he give it in this verse? Yeah. The answer is real simple. You remember what he said about marriage to begin with? A man shall leave his father and his mother shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So he says here, your father's wife is uncovering the nakedness of your father because she is his wife. There is a connection, a oneness about them. And to do this is not the same thing as being with your father, but it's equal to it because of this oneness that they possess. Yes. Well, there's some people that, yes, there's some people that suggest that. Yep, there's some people that suggest that.
This is like a commandment that somebody had sent.
It is a sin. Right. It is a sin. But up until this point, these things had never been said. Verse 9, your sibling, your sister. Verse 10, your granddaughter. Verse 11, your half sister. Oh, we've already seen righteous, godly people who have been in that situation. But now you can't do it. From this point on, this law has been given, this judgment has been made. If you're going to walk with God and be in this protection of atonement that he is bringing, he says, don't do this thing. Your aunt, verses 12 and 13, and then the same thing here that he did with your father and mother, your uncle's wife. This is now, whether or not the aunt is the sister of your father or the sister of your mother, the actual blood aunt, or if, and that's where I tend to read this. And so it would be the sibling of your parent. And then this next verse is the spouse of the sibling of your parent. Verse 15, your daughter-in-law. Verse 16, your brother's wife. Now, interestingly enough, and to make my point even stronger that I made at the outset, what would he later command if someone died without an heir? That the closest brother had to marry and bear children in the brother's name. So this is not a physiological thing that he's doing here. He's not trying to protect their gene pool and make sure that there's no inbreeding going on and make them smarter than anybody else or whatever people seem to think about it. This is purely, this is what I want you to do. I want you to be different than the way people are living in the world. I want you to be distinctly moral and draw some lines of distinction about what is proper and what is improper in this respect. So not your daughter-in-law, verse 15, not your brother's wife in verse 16. Verse 17, not a woman and her daughter or granddaughter. Verse 18, not a woman and her sister as a rival wife. Now, where did we see that? What about Rachel and Leah? Whose wives were Rachel and Leah? Jacob. What was Jacob's name changed to? Israel. The direct beginning of this nation. The man who was the head of this nation, whom this nation was named after, was married to sisters, but now God says, don't do that. It wasn't. But if he had lived under this, he couldn't have done that. If he had lived under this, what would have his responsibility been when he was deceived and given the wrong wife? He would have been stuck with her. Well, he was stuck with her. But just her. It would have been improper for him to marry her sister. That was not a hang-up for them at the time because God had never said, don't do this. Now, let's not even get into the discussion right now about the fact that God wasn't even satisfied with the idea of having more than one wife. And when Jesus is asked about that specifically, what did he say? That is not the way it was intended. That is not what God said at the beginning. At the beginning, God said that a man shall leave his father and mother, shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one. That is what God's intent was from the beginning. So these restrictions aren't even going to the extreme of what God really desired. they're just moving in that direction. These boundaries are declared as the Lord's judgment in this chapter. This is my judgment on the matter. Does it matter what our judgment is? And he says, no, if you want to live, then you walk by my judgments. The relationships he's established are not to be violated, and what God has ordered is not to be treated as common. When God says this is good, then it's good. When he says this is bad, then it's bad. And we don't treat it as being a common thing that doesn't really matter. It's not just a judgment call. There's a lot of people out there who go, well, it's not that big a deal. It's just kind of a judgment call. I know that's what it said, but it's just kind of a judgment call. No, there's no judgment call. God's judgments are the only ones that matter. And he's teaching that lesson. So in verses 19 through 23, to me, this is the most complex part of this entire chapter. And the structure of it is interesting to me. Now, I believe that the structure has a purpose. And very often when you construct things in a particular form, you are drawing attention to a specific thing. Okay, we in scholarly writing tend to have a thesis statement. That's the ruling statement behind a whole paper. That is stated basically at the end of the introduction, and then everything else in the paper is about that thesis. And then the conclusion is tying it all together and saying, this is why the thesis is true. There's a different way of organizing things. You can organize things so that the central thing is the key, and you work up to it, and then you work away from it, which is exactly how the book of Leviticus is organized, with chapter 16 being the central and most important thing, because the question that's being asked is, how can sinful man, how can they relate to a perfect, sinless God? How can man stand before God? How can man have a relationship with God? It's too unequal. And this book is all about how it's possible, the atonement. The atonement removes our sins from us, and then we can have that relationship. I think that this section is organized in much the same way. So he says, don't approach a woman during her menstrual impurity. Now, he's already talked about in the uncleanness section of this book that time was a period in which she was unclean, and anybody that touched her was unclean. And so that makes perfect sense. If you touch her, then you become unclean. And that's what he says here. Adultery with a neighbor's wife is forbidden in verse 20. Well, there's a lot of adultery that's forbidden, like all of it. So what difference does it make that it's your neighbor's wife? I'm going to skip verse 21 for a minute. We're going to come back to it because I'm going to organize this in a different way. Verse 22, a man's not to lie with a male as with a woman. So homosexual relationships, not good. Verse 23, it's the one that's still shocking to almost everyone. I don't know that it's always going to be that way. I'm going to go ahead and tell you up front. If we keep traveling in the direction that we're traveling, this soon will be as normal as all this other stuff. And that is, animals are off limits. You don't have that kind of relationship with an animal. Now, all of those things are directly related to what? Sexual behavior. Those four things that are found in verse 19, verse 20, verse 22, verse 23, all about sexual behavior, but stuck right in the middle of that list in verse 21. Look at it with me. Neither shall you give any of your offspring to offer them up to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. There's our phrase again, that repeated phrase that we see all through this chapter, I am the Lord. And we get to what I believe is showing us that what he's really talking about here is us recognizing his authority. We don't give our offspring to a false god. And then notice the parallelism. Nor shall you profane the name of the Lord. To do any of these things is to profane the name of the Lord. Any of these things. Profane the name of the Lord is the broad category in which all of these things fall into. And that's what he's talking about. Why does it matter? If it was okay for Abraham and Sarah to marry, if it was okay for Jacob to be married to Leah and Rachel, if it was okay for the children of Adam and Eve to marry their siblings, if none of that had any horrible repercussions, then why does it matter now? And that phrase in that verse explains why it matters now. Do not profane my name. I am the Lord. It matters because I said it matters. And that needs to matter to you. Yes.
Back at the beginning of the chapter, we said in the land of Egypt. This is important. The Israelites were very influenced by the outside world. He's about to bring them into a land and out of the land. The Egyptians, and this is facts, former Egyptologists, with the help of forensic scientists, discovered that a lot of the mummies were diseased from eating raw pork. It was a god of theirs. They worshiped the pig. Herodotus, the great Greek historian, in his annals, in one of his letters when he visited Egypt, said he saw the females having sex with the he-goats outside of the temple. They were having sex with them to praise their gods. Third thing is the inter-family sexual acts. If you look at King Tut and other things that was going on in Egypt in the ancient world, they were all interbred with one another, brothers and sisters.
No, we can look at much more frequent history than that too to see the same problem. The kings of England and Western Europe. But anyway,
was going on right closer to that era and before that, even after. So the people he's talking to was, from my understanding, also, and where you're going is correct as well, but he was making them a chosen people, separate, holy, apart from the pagans, which they once was doing the same thing, but now he's restricting all of this and putting this law on them to make them more separate and holy and not to do what they do, so that can come from a pure lineage and not from all of these things as well, to a degree.
as long as you don't take that too far, I wouldn't argue. The pure lineage thing is part of what gives rise to a lot of the division that exists among men that's not pleasing to God. The idea that there is a ethnicity of people, a race of people, a nationality of people that are more pure and more honorable and better than others. Which, by the way, the Jews did begin to think of themselves that way.
It wasn't about their ethnicity,
Right.
Law that God gave.
Which is why I say you don't take that too far. That the word, throwing the word pure in there can be dangerous because it's misunderstood. What we want to look at is verses 24 and 25, and I'm not going to have time to cover all of the language of this chapter, but we're getting the brunt and the focus of the teaching. 24 and 25. Do not defile yourselves. That's what he's talking about. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all these the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled. For the land has become defiled, therefore I have visited its punishment upon it, so the land has spewed out its inhabitants. Now, what he's saying to them is, these are the kinds of things that the Canaanites do. These are the kinds of things that the Egyptians did. What did he do to those two nations? He judged them. He was about to judge the Canaanites and throw them out of the land. And that's how they were going to get their possession of the land. He is laying a foundation saying, I need you to be a people who listen to my judgments because, and this is where he's going to lead down the road, as long as you're walking in my statutes, you will always possess the land. I'll make sure of that. But if you do not follow my judgments, you will be destroyed. And that's eventually what happened to them. Why did it happen to them? Because they did not follow the commands of God. It wasn't the physiological aspects of the commandments. It was the fact that they did not receive God as their Lord. The moment we quit following God's judgments, we are not accepting him as Lord. That's why he repeatedly says to this chapter, I am the Lord. Do this because I say do it. And if you do it, he started off at the very beginning of the chapter, by doing these things, you may live. That's what we all want to do. Well, okay, if you want to do it, listen to my judgments, respect my judgments, follow my judgments. Whether they seem good to you or not doesn't matter. When we get to the New Testament, why did John the Baptist get killed? He got his head cut off. Why did that happen? What did he do that was so terrible that got him executed? I'll tell you what he did. He looked at the king and said, you don't have a right to have your brother's wife. Something this chapter just talked about. He looked at the man and said, it is wrong for you to have your brother's wife. And because he said that, he got his head chopped off. That is where the people went. Where someone says, I don't care that God says it's not right for me to have this person as my wife. I'm going to take her as a wife anyway. So when we get to the New Testament and he says that it is adultery for a man to marry someone who's been divorced without cause. And I say, I don't care. I'm going to take her as my wife anyway. That is saying to God, you are not my Lord. I don't have to listen to you, and my judgment in this matter is more important than your judgment. That's why this stuff matters and why it affects every aspect of who we are. And that's the other point that he's making in these things. He's not limiting this to what they do in the temple, actively worshiping God. This is day-to-day life, who your spouse is, how you handle your food, what you do with the things that you own. I got to stop. Appreciate everybody's participation and attention tonight.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story.